Okay, where's the clicker? There's the clicker. Okay, it's the diversity talk. It's the diversity talk. So I'm here to talk to you about diversity in design across my 10-ish year career. I just want to always recap content warnings for talks. I think it's a good practice to do. So this talk includes things like misgendering, ableism, racism, visual representations of transgender people, LGBTQIA representation, and ageism. What I like to say at the beginning of the talk is that if any of these things at any point make you feel uncomfortable, you are absolutely more than welcome to leave the room. I think that you should always have that right when you feel uncomfortable. So in this talk, the kinds of things that I'm going to cover, I'm going to cover 4 different kind of design topics. I'm going to cover illustration and photography, UI and UX. And a lot of these are my own experiences, super awkward conversations with work colleagues of ye olde jobs past. And a lot of it's going to be maybe not necessarily great answers to a lot of these questions. Some of them are going to raise more questions than they do give them answers. But really it's about raising the awareness of the fact that these kind of conversations can be had, and they're very important to be had. So one of my favorite books, because we all have a good book recommendation list at a design conference, is The Politics of Design. Very, very worth reading. So there's a quote in that book that says, the tools are never completely neutral, and their settings reflect the cultural bias of the technicians that calibrate them. But actually, yeah, let's cover a little bit about me, the technician that calibrates these tools, right? So my name's Eriol. I'm a designer of many different titles, actually. So I've been anything from like a UI designer specifically to, I just call myself a designer now, designer of stuff. I'm a non-binary person, and I'm trans, no matter what people might think I look like. I use they, them, their pronouns, and I use mix instead of Mr. or Mrs. You may have noticed I brought in some really nice pronoun badges, and I dropped them off on the table. Please help yourself to them. I'm a queer person. I have an invisible disability or illness, PTSD. I was and am a carer for parents and children. One of them was terminally ill and passed away, and one of them is critically ill still. And I'm a white person. And now a little bit about the tools in which I calibrate. So I don't actually go into much depth about the stuff I do at Shahidi here, but I want to make sure that you folks know what happens at Shahidi. So Shahidi is a Kenyan tech company, so it was founded in Kenya in 2007, 2008. In Kenya, there is a prevalence when elections come around for violence to happen. So violence happens typically from a political perspective due to tribal affiliations with different politicians. And what happened in 2007, 2008, was when there were the national elections, a lot of people in the rural areas were having lots of violence, lots of human rights abuses, right? And the founders wanted to create a tool to help them raise their voices. Shahidi, testimony, raise your voice. So they created an open source, which means free and open to use, so you don't have to pay for it, a tool that is a data collection tool. And it was used in those elections first. And since then, it's been used in a lot of different ways. It's mostly been used in crisis response. So the example here is when it was used in Nepal when there was an earthquake, the big earthquake. And people used it to map where people needed resources, like things like basic needs, but also where people needed help and where trees had been felled, roads had been destroyed. And the UN actually coordinated with the Nepalese army to send in helicopters to those areas. And unless you know a little bit about the way the humanitarian aid kind of functions, this is kind of radical. A lot of it's from a top-down approach, like they go in, they say, an earthquake's happened, you need blankets and water. This was flipping the script and saying that the community was telling the organizations what they needed. So it's about enabling communities with the tools in which they need to raise their voices and survive. And we've got a few other tools, but the other one that we have made is a crisis communication tool. This was one that we created after there was a terrorist attack on a mall in Nairobi. So there was a gunman in this mall, and this might be a familiar scenario to you. You know when you're trying to get hold of a friend and you text them and then you call them, and then maybe because you know that they're out with another friend, you text or call that friend, and you're trying to get hold of someone just to, like, I don't know, find out where they are. But imagine that scenario and when there's a terrorist attack. So we went into the office after the weekend when this happened, and we created this tool that aggregates all the different communication methods so that you use one place to send out a communication to your team to find out whether they're safe. We're also working on some really interesting projects to do with peace tech. I've just come back from Kazakhstan, where I'm training people that are looking at how technology can help prevent radicalization in Central Asia. And we also did some work around the genocide in Rwanda and some of the violence that happens in Kenya. And we're also working on how to open up the design process to open source methods, which is real cool. And I think one of the most interesting and important things to say about Shahidi is it was the first company that I was happy and comfortable and felt able to be out in, which is really important. So if you want to hear more about Shahidi, always happy to talk about Shahidi. I've got a couple of talks about designing for crisis scenarios that are online. But I'm here to talk about diversity in design. So this is the first one that I'm going to talk about. It's illustration project. So I worked for a parental tech company, and they had a brief. Their brief was around Christmas time. It was for a series of blog images. This was only one of many. And the brief was very simple, a family doing a conga line. And this was a few years ago, before I really was, I was just stepping into this role of really advocating for diversity in the work that I did. And I thought, great, this is an opportunity to draw different ages, different skin tones, different kinds of family makeups, do some visible disabilities in there. And what we've got here is a close-up of some of those characters. You can see one of them's got a hearing aid device in their ear, and the other one's holding the red and white striped cane, which is typically the signifier for people that are deaf and blind, yeah, or visually impaired and hearing impaired. And I was like, yes, I'm so excited to draw diversity. And illustration is one of those things where really what you draw is limited by your imagination, right? You can, as long as you're happy and comfortable drawing something, there's no reason why we shouldn't be drawing people with different skin tones, different kinds of family makeups, disabilities, those kind of things. But this image didn't get used. It didn't go live. These ones did. And I remember one of the first, not that there's much wrong with these images at all, really. They describe what was needed at the time. But I remember thinking, I wonder why that conga line image wasn't used. And I went up to my colleague, because we had a good relationship, and I was like, are we going to use that image? Is there any particular reason that did it not meet the brief? And it kind of was like, well, maybe we'll go live with it some other time, or maybe we'll use it for the next set. And that was definitely a point of my life where I was like, not going to push this too hard. I'm not feeling completely comfortable pushing and advocating for this. I don't know enough right now to adequately advocate for this kind of stuff. But I know that there's something here around being uncomfortable with being presented with something which isn't your target demographic. And one of the funny things about this company is the more that I worked there and the more work that I produced for them around photography and different things for marketing, and the more I dug into things like analytics, working really closely with the analytics person on the team, was the more we discovered that actually one of our biggest purchasers was African American families in the US. So I was like, time to add some African American families into those imagery, and sales. Woo! So that's a nice little tip there, that if in doubt, you can go to the analytics. Hopefully you're going to find some statistics to back up your need for diversity within your imagery. But yeah, these conversations where you unearth this kind of unconscious, bias, these kinds of things that all of us to some extent think about, they're really, really tough at first to be tackling. And I don't want to downplay that. But it really, on a personal note, it really affected my ability to feel comfortable as myself within the organization, just at a point when I was considering including more same-sex couples in the imagery as well, because parental tech, there are same-sex parents that have kids that need parental tech. They need to be represented in this too. So, moving on from illustration, another awkward conversation. This is actually a Shahidi project. So this was a project we did with an organization, a partner organization, where it was creating a series of posters for clinics in Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. This was one of my first projects at Shahidi, actually. And they were posters and WhatsApp images to go up in clinics, and it was around HIV and AIDS prevention for adolescent girls and women. And they asked me to create some posters and some graphics, and I was like, okay, well, we've got a brand guidelines. Not too keen on how much pink is used in the brand guidelines, but I'll go with it. It's a brand guidelines. I'm not gonna push too much. But they asked for some photography versions as well. So I was like, okay, cool. Let's take a look at the photography that's used by the partner organisation to use those in the imagery. Oh, hello. Here they are. And I was like, okay, these are used by our partner organisation. Let's go with these. We'll put some of those in. But I remember creating these designs, and I was thinking, not quite sure about these images. I mean, they're used by our partners, but maybe they're not the most accurate representation of people that live in these countries. How do I know what the most accurate representation of people in these countries are? Well, actually, I work with some of them, so let's ask them. Let's have an awkward conversation. And this was one of the most tough conversations that I've had to date, because it really centered around my personal ingrained biases around what I think a young girl that may be at risk of HIV and AIDS in Africa looks like. One of the big pieces of research that I did that I think is really, really useful to do is actually, I went to Google image search, and I looked for young women in Kenya, young women in Nairobi, young women in Kampala. And I also went to Instagram and looked at the hashtags as well. And what I largely saw was not buckets for collecting water, and not clothes that were ill-fitting and things like that. I saw people very much the same as you would see in any country. So I used some of these images in some of the posters that I presented. But I presented these ones first, and I had this conversation with my workmate, and they said to me, please, don't use the image of the girls with buckets. We really want to go with these. These are so much more representational and accurate of the people that we're trying to target within these groups. And it doesn't speak down to them. It doesn't have this Western view of what somebody that needs this service is. And something I learned really quickly working with this kind of imagery is that there's a lot to learn here. I had to be really careful and understand that this is a typical hairstyle for Nairobi or Kenya, and that this is a typical skin color skin tone for this area, because to my eye it is harder to distinguish. And I did the research, and I asked the questions, and they were really hard to ask, but I still did it. And it's very important to do that education piece, learn about different hairstyles, learn about how people are accurately represented in the place where you want to represent them. And also light, when you're taking photos, if you take your own photos for your own products, try and hire somebody who takes photos of people with darker skin tones more regularly, because there isn't very different ways that you can light those pieces of photography to be more flattering to people. So, moving on to stock photography, the scary world of stock photography. We all have to use stock photography from now and then. I know I do. And one of the things that I am a personal advocate for as a trans, non-binary, queer person is I'm really interested in how we are represented within the larger community, visually. So I actually before this, I hadn't done this search before. I went to a popular stock photography site, and I typed in the word trans person, and slightly terrified to click the search button. And I was actually pleasantly surprised with what results came up. We've got, on the screen here, we've got a couple of humans, people wearing dresses, people with long hair. We've also got some kind of toilet sign that is half what is a typical sort of skirted person and non-skirted person, although I've heard that that's actually supposed to be a cape. You should look it up. It's actually, I think it was originally designed to be a cape or something like that. Or maybe that's just wishful thinking. So we've also got a pride flag, and we've got some things around boys and girls. And I was like, okay, this isn't too bad. This is better than I expected. And actually, the descriptions of the pieces of photography were better than I expected. So we've got a portrait of a female transgender with brown hair looking away, which is great. It's great. The tagging is actually, sensitive and well described. And then I got a little bit deeper into the results, and I started to, think, okay, if I'm not a person that's within this community, and I'm looking to accurately represent this community within the visual medium that I'm using for my products, are these images helping me to do that with empathy, with sympathy, with understanding? And what we've got here, just to describe these images out for anyone that is sight impaired, we've got the symbols in the top left-hand corner, typically like the circle and the plus sign, which is typically like the female symbol. We've got also the one that's the arrow with the male symbol, and we've got a few variations of those. We've got some more pride flags, and then we've got some imagery which made me feel uncomfortable, given the sort of, I want to kind of say poetic, or the implications of the photography. So we've got somebody with facial hair, with red nails and red lipstick, with a sort of shushing noise going on. So really like perpetuating this sort of secrecy sort of imagery. And then we've also got somebody holding a sort of image of a body with breasts and bra and panties in front of their body, which you cannot see the kind of structure of their body behind. And firstly, not a lot of people would maybe be able to pick out the trans symbol out of the symbols in the left-hand corner. Is there a clicky thing? It's the one in the bottom right is used, but it's not actually used that much. It's less popular than the trans flag, which is our pink, white and blue flag that we use more regularly. And these images that really perpetuate this secrecy, this sort of thing about not being in the right body, these kinds of things, really struck me and made me think about this thing that we have within a visual culture that we exist in and that we represent and feed back to people, around like these whispers that say a trans woman must look like this to be viewed as a trans woman, or a lesbian must have these visual characteristics, or this person looks like this, these are our boxes and this is what we understand. And it's especially interesting when the variety of trans people, non-binary people and genderqueer people are hugely varied, hugely varied. And you can't say that a certain category of person looks a certain way. But how do we still exist within a visual medium where we want to accurately represent people, right? And how do we move away from this default thinking that the best way to represent people is straight, white, male, woman, thin, able-bodied, all this kind of stuff. But there are some good resources out there. These are the ones that I typically use. We've got African Stock Photo, which is great. Photoability is great as a resource for people with visual disabilities if you want to accurately represent people there. And women of colour in tech, free photos there. And we've got our own Bristol-based TechSpark have supported Joyanne, who is here. She really wanted to use images on her own website of, she's a social media, she runs a social media company, and she wanted just a stock image of somebody with the same skin tone as her using a phone, and she couldn't find it anywhere online. So she was like, right, TechSpark, I'm going to make my own, make them free, put them on the TechSpark website, here you go. So those are all free, great project, really recommend looking them up. But this idea of how we represent people and how we move away from that cultural bias of this, this is what the right way to represent this person or the right person to represent and sell this product is, I think the best way to move away from that is to use your real users. So this is from meetup.com. It's the London Pugs meetup. And depending on your opinions of photography, you could argue that this is not a great piece of photography as far as the staging goes, the positioning goes. But what it is it's real. It's really the London Pugs meetup. and the people there are represented in the ways that they are representing themselves. And it really brings forth the idea from that meetup.com uses, like this is the community. And I would really urge all of you within your products, within your companies, to reach out to your users, to include them in your visual media, if they're happy to be. Or alternatively, if you have to use stock photography, users are very happy to, a lot of the time, feedback on whether stock photography accurately represents them, especially if they're part of a minority. So it's never a bad idea to ask your user base, hey, does this accurately represent you as a person who identifies this way? So, moving on to UX. So, this is real. I don't want to throw shade at the person that wrote this, but this is from a session, like a kind of product problem session that I worked on with my team at the parental tech company again. And it says feminizing the experience for those who might struggle to read this. And one of the things I think about a lot with user experience is how closely sometimes the conversations around user experience are linked to things like marketing, or marketing kind of pushes, or how we get a certain set of people to use something, right? And how we perceive that group of people and how we want to best target those people. It kind of feels very marketing to me a lot of the time. And to go back to this awkward conversation about feminizing the experience, I was like, okay, so somebody's written down feminizing the experience. What do you actually mean? And so the conversation then got more awkward, and and they were like, well, it's just too techy for women, and women just won't. They're not using it. We want more women to buy it. We want them to buy it. We want them to buy it. We want them to use it. We don't want it to look too techy because we think that that's a barrier for them to be using it. And I was like, okay. So we've got a problem here, and we need to figure out how to address this. And the conversations went to the shall we make it all pink area of conversation, and thankfully moved very quickly away from the make it all pink area of the conversation. And eventually, after many hours of awkward conversation, I got down to the statement, just making it more female friendly. We just want to make it more female friendly. And then I replied, how about more friendly without the female part? And they were like, oh, I see. So really the problem with this product was that the impression of it was that it was something that you did work on at the moment. So the UI was very sort of like a workflow that you might use, like that was similar to office products, say. And this application was very much supposed to be a lifestyle product, something that you use very quickly, something that you used with your family, and needed to represent those kinds of values a lot more. So we addressed the problem of feminizing the experience from that perspective through having that awkward conversation. And to get sort of, I love these. These are hilarious. I think we do need to really laugh at these. What we've got here is the hashtag masculinity is so fragile, and some images that we've got men's tea. This one is, I think, chapstick for men. And then we've got specific sunscreen for men, factor 50 for men. And then my favorite is the men's ultimate multi-tool, which is the cotton buds you clean your ears with, or you whatever you use cotton buds for. But it's an ultimate tool when it's for men. And I think it's really important to laugh at these, otherwise, a lot of the time I'd cry. And to drill down into this, the tissue example is one in particular. I actually think that maybe this brand, it's on the screen, so I'll just say it, Kleenex. I think they've actually started to remove man size from their vocabulary. But in contrast, you've got not man size, which have like an ultra soft label, but man size don't have ultra soft. And I'm like, why do men not want ultra soft tissues? It seemed a bit ridiculous to me that when you've got a sore nose, you'd rather it be larger size than anyway, very bizarre. But to get down, like I said, these things need to be laughed at. But when you look at the real life implications as a person who fits into neither male nor female category, and perhaps somebody who's transitioning between one or the other, or fluctuating in between, the process that this user, this person, goes through when they're in the store just trying to buy tissues for their runny nose, is that this product isn't for me. I can't have this product. This is just not for me, even though it might be something that's really useful for me. It's an incredibly isolating experience to feel like, that when you take this product up to the cashier, that maybe they'll look at it and they'll sort of scrutinize whether or not you're the person that should buy this product, right? Yeah, really, really tough. So I like to go back to the analogy or the statement that it should make something usable, relevant, and simple for anyone to use, regardless of what gender markers you might want to give your products. And one of the most interesting examples that came out of one of these talks was somebody came up to me afterwards and said that they're making a fitness app, and they have people that want fitness that are like this, and people that are like this. And the way that people want to use the app is that people that are like this want to do certain this, and people that are like this maybe want to do more this, or whatever conversation we ended up having. And they were like, actually, how can I make this less like this? What are the ways in which I can move away from this kind of thinking? And I was like, well, allow people to choose which one they best represent, like that they feel best represents them, or choose a body shape that isn't this or this, because even if you identify as a woman, you might not be this. And even if you identify as a man, you might not be like this. Not everyone fits into those categories regardless of how they identify. Or make it the generic shape. It doesn't need to be gendered. Doesn't need to be gendered. And then a similar example was the fertility apps, the period tracker apps for people that menstruate, that focus on fertility and use like very feminine gendered language, where there are men that menstruate. That exists, and they need period tracker apps. So I'm going to go into UI because I'm not actually sure how much time I've got left. So we're going to go through some UI. This is an example of a very awkward conversation from a company that I used to work at that is a student accommodation service. They had a part of their buying a room in a flat where you had to indicate your gender. And the options that you get are male and female, not specified, the third gender, the mystical third gender of not specified. But not specified was interesting because it was the selection that you chose to not share your gender with potential future flatmates. But what about if you are neither of those categories, but you do want to share your gender with your future flatmates? Or, all the different variations of gender that now exist and that should be represented. And I remember having the awkward conversation, like, why does this exist in our form? Why do we need to know this? And it was like, well, there's lots of different reasons this exists in our form. Primarily, it was because when somebody ticked male, they got placed in a room in a flat with other males, or other people that identified male, and likewise for female. And I was like, well, why don't you give them the touch the microphone, whoops. Why don't you give them the option to choose who they want to live with, right? You're going to live with somebody for 3 years. You should be able to make that choice yourself. And they were like, students, right, they get easily distracted, and we don't want them to be distracted when they're supposed to be studying. And I was like, what do you mean by distractions? Should we put in more study spaces? All this kind of stuff. And eventually it got down to the part of the conversation was like, well, we don't want them to have sex. No sex. To which I replied, very awkwardly, do you know, sometimes men have sex with men, and sometimes women have sex with women. They do. I've seen it. And they were like, And I found this really, really interesting because I'd not long been in a property where I'd been volunteering to do the check-in process, and the amount of same-sex couples that were just holding hands or just variations of different gender expressions that I'd had conversations with, they were there. And more the young people of today and services that serve young people, more and more the people are able and comfortable to identify in the way that they want to and have the partners that they want to. So it feels very counterproductive as a service trying to target those people to not recognise that. Thankfully, I think they've changed this now. On to other things that are awful in UI. So this is going to be a bit quick and rapid fire, and hopefully you'll be able to find some things that you can change in your services from these examples. So as a person who's changed their name from one name to another, I very much do not like it when people refer to my old name as my real name and refer to the name that I go by as whatever other name they deem to refer to it as. Very much recommend that you avoid that. The name that somebody goes by and introduces themselves as is their real name. So if you're doing something like where you need to ask for matching ID, and some people change their name but never change their ID, and some people change their name and do change their ID. But if they are in this transitionary period where one doesn't match the other, if you need to ask for matching ID, make it so that they don't have to put an essay for their preferred name or their name that they like to go by and then their legal name within a tiny form field. And yeah, Dr. Male, Dr. Female, why? First thing, Dr. Male, Dr. Female, why? Okay. But you can avoid, by adding in these extra options, and I know a lot of people come up to me and say, oh, but, you know, it takes this much time to get an extra form field changed and dev time and et cetera, and I know those woes, I definitely know those woes. But you avoid complaints like this, where people are asking you to add in the new and very legal titles for people to be able to use. So this is MX, so the title MX, which is regularly used now by the UK government, and actually widely used elsewhere. And one thing that's very new, actually, and I'm just starting to investigate it in relation to this talk, is after doing this in places like Germany and France and Spain, the fact that there's actually gendered language. And, you know, somebody came up to me and said, oh, how do I avoid, you know, gendered language when we have a fundamental gendered language for objects? And I found this really, really great article if you want to investigate some of the thought around that. And I don't have a good answer for that yet. I really don't, other than places like Sweden, which are moving more towards gender-neutral terms, so that they've created a new pronoun for people that identify gender-neutral called hen. So it's just proof that languages can progress as people want to identify differently. Stuff to do with collecting demographic data better. One of the things that you can do a lot better is give checkboxes instead of radio boxes for ethnicity. Somebody doesn't always just identify as, you know, Black African. They might also be any combination of any of these ethnicities. Give them the option to give you that information. And the stuff about gender, they prefer not to say in the none of your business. You know, a lot of people think that this is a good option, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it's good to put it in there. But as a person who spent 30 years, well, I was a baby for some of those, so I wasn't able to give my pronouns and gender expression. But for a good 30 years, I've been closeted. I've not been able to express my preference. The services and websites that are able and give me the opportunity to express my preferences gain my loyalty for life. I would prefer to tell you how I identify now, because I'm proud. And it's great that I'm able and relatively safe now to be the person that I want to identify as. So if you need a convincing argument for your team, there's one. And there is such a thing as sometimes too many options. It's good to just strike a balance. Here's some more examples, you know, some great stuff that's been, so ones where they've added in mix, ones where they've added in, but I prefer to be known as. So there are some really sensitive ways that you can gather like the sex at birth versus the one that people identify as now in sympathetic ways. Here are some. And there's also the option where you can ask them to really describe how they do that. And again, so a lot of these kinds of conversations I was having in workplaces, and really the awkwardness of the conversations was around this term, which is largely actually out of circulation, which I'm really pleased about. Not a lot of people use the term edge cases anymore, which is amazing. And I found it as a term that was typically used to shut down conversations about marginalised people, right? That's an edge case, it's only going to affect 5% of our total cha-ching customers, so we're not going to look at it. And I really hate that this is a term to discourage that kind of exploration into how you can make things more accessible and more inclusive of people that need your attention the most, because they're the most unrepresented and uncared for people in society. And I'm glad that we're moving more towards like a terminology around stress cases, so people that need our empathy and attention the most. And again, lots of people ask me at the end of this talk, you know, I'm having trouble selling this idea into the company or whoever. There's always people that will need convincing. There's several ways in which you can convince them. Loyalty is one thing. The spending power of LGBT people, there's lots of statistics online of the coin that they have and the coin that they will spend on inclusive services is there. But if one of my main ones that I like to rely on is, you know, that there are so many people identifying this way now, you're cutting out not 5% anymore, you're cutting out a ever-growing percentage of people. And, you know, the more that we create services which include, the less we'll see this kind of harmful activity towards people that express differently. So here we've got, you know, people saying on the social medias that different gender identities are mental disorders and brainwashing young people into thinking that, you know, it's degenerate and things like that. And then, you know, these statistics come from Stonewall and the National Center for Transgender Equality in the US. And, you know, just the fact that 2 in 5 LGBT people who identify as non-binary experience hate crime, the more that we can do as designers, as people that design products to mitigate this kinds of stuff and give safe places for these people to express themselves, the more that will make these impacts on society at large. So I've got a nice statement here that I quite like, that I like to try and wrap up on. It's as designers, we're at the forefront of how products serve users, but also how the digital and physical world represents and reflects back at its users, and that we have a responsibility to be inclusive, sensitive, and understanding with what we design, and to endeavour to help non-marginalised folk foster their acceptance and expose them to systems that include rather than exclude. Give myself a C+ for inclusion most of the time. Pretty hard on myself most of the time. But even when you're, you know, a part of a marginalised group, you don't always get it right. There's not perfection here. We're not striving for perfection as individuals. We're striving for continual betterment of how we engage with other humans here. And sometimes I give myself a B if I'm feeling really, really nice. And what I would recommend that people do, really, there's some things that you can do, is ask people when it's safe and encouraged to do so about how they express their gender, about different issues to do with how they are represented and how they feel marginalised in a society because of their ethnicity or because of their religion or because of something that they're marginalised by. Talk about the issues not just with the marginalised people and get comfortable with being uncomfortable, really, really difficult part. And one thing that I find continually difficult is question your words and assumptions and where these come from. So I had a real hard time removing the vocabulary of guys in reference to a large group of people from this. It can be incredibly harmful to people that are thinking about transitioning or have transitioned from one to the other and to be referred to as what they They considered what they used to be as incredibly harmful. I prefer folks now, very much like the word folks, friends, people, comrades, team, lots of different options. And also, seeking alternatives to other things. The one that I find most difficult at the moment is the term crazy. For something that's like disordered, messy, or not great, using term crazy is very alienating to those of us with mental health problems and difficulties. And for those of you that can go a little bit further, maybe with cash monies or time, volunteer or sponsor for these kinds of things. So a local pride or LGBTQIA+ event or organisation, a group that supports people with disabilities and impairments, and groups and organisations that promote people of colour in technology. These exist and they will happily take your donations. And again, many books of which to read. I highly recommend Technically Wrong as well. National Geographic put out a great issue about the gender revolution, about gender identities, and some great stuff that you can download from various places online. So I'm going to end on these wonderful resources and the statement that if you have ever had a question that you might have wanted to ask a person that identifies in the way that I identified at the beginning, that this is an open invitation to ask a question that you may be afraid to ask. And also, I have a free book. I haven't got it with me because I'm moving house at the moment, but if you tweet me like a really cool cat pic, then you can totally get this amazing book by Nanjala Nyabola. She's a Kenyan tech activist, and it's a fantastic book. So yeah. Thanks.